welcome back to the program. Thanks for your company. We're joined now by the head of the Business Council of Australia, Jennifer Westacott. Thanks very much for your company.
Thank you.
We just had the Employment Minister, Michaelia Cash, on. You would have heard the interview. I mentioned right at the start of it that I took the view that when you were out here, you'd probably lament there not being enough IR reform in the government's wider package, or indeed enough focus on it. Is that right?
Well, I think it is now the time to have a discussion about IR in an election campaign, which is starting to become a bit of a race to the bottom of things we're not going to do, and a very divisive election campaign. So is that the right environment to have that discussion? Look, we would have liked to have seen a more ambitious agenda by the government over the last 3 years on industrial relations. There's no doubt about that. You've got to do things step by step. I mean, getting the Building and Construction Commission re-established is a huge step, and we've got to achieve it because it'll have a flow-on effect in terms of restoring confidence in our capacity to get things done and the integrity of the IR system. But beyond that, we need to see a response to the Productivity Commission's report, and we need to have a mature adult conversation about some of the things that are not in that report, like the highly over-regulated enterprise bargaining process, which has got too many things in it, holding companies back, and the very, very complex award system. But this is a very divisive issue. We know this. You know, it's a divisive election campaign with this, you know, anti-business agenda being run by the Labor Party. Is that the right place to have an adult conversation about IR? I think it's a very big risk.
Well, despite that comment, though, this is a double dissolution election based on industrial relations bills. Would you like to see the Prime Minister therefore making industrial relations more of an issue in the rest of the election campaign?
Well, I think you've certainly got to talk about the ABCC. You've got to talk about the Building and Construction Commission. It's the trigger for the election, and it's hugely important. I mean, you know, the flow-on effects of criminal activity, corrupt activity, into productivity in the construction industry, a huge part of our economy where our building projects less productive, much more expensive. We need to have that debate. We need to remind Australians, why are we having this discussion about the Building and Construction Commission? Because it's holding back a huge part of our economy. We've had 4 royal commissions. We need to get on with this.
Now, I'd like to ask you about the attacks on business, the fact that there's an element of class warfare in this election campaign. How concerned are chief executives in the business community about the nature of this election, and how concerned is the BCA about the entire tenor of this debate, and what are the implications?
Yeah, look, it's a very good question, Paul. I think people are bewildered by this attack on business for a few reasons. The first is this idea that somehow business is not the community, that business is some thing outside of the community. I mean, who is business? It's the 10 million people who work in business. It's the small business people who are struggling, working hard every day to run a shop, to make a bit of a living, to improve their lives. It's the people who've got shares in a company just to add to their wealth. It's the people who've got superannuation who require those companies to do well. That is the business community. So this idea about, you know, this anti-business, well, if you're anti-business, you're anti the 10 million people who work in businesses. You're anti those superannuation holders. It's gobsmacking, this. And it's very dangerous. It's dangerous for our reputation, and it's dangerous to set us on the course where we're saying, well, we're not going to improve our competitiveness. We're not going to actually deal with the business environment here. Well, how are we going to grow our economy when 80% of economic output is dependent on business if we're not going to improve the business conditions? I mean, people are very, very worried about this. They're very concerned about it reputationally, and they're very concerned about people locking themselves into policies where, irrespective of who forms government, somebody has to tackle the competitiveness issues in this economy. And this kind of, you know, it's business or it's education is a terrible choice to put to the Australian community.
It's a phony choice.
It's a phony choice. It's a phony choice.
Why is it a phony choice?
Well, it's a phony choice because you have to have a strong business community to actually grow the economy so you can pay for education and pay for the health services. I mean, where's this spending all going to be paid for in the future?
Where did the change, where, in your opinion, did the change come from in Labor on this? I wrote about this in The Australian yesterday, you know, quote after quote of Labor finance spokespeople in favour of company tax cuts just a few short years ago. Now they're not. What's changed?
Politics. I mean, this is absolutely politics-driven, poll-driven, and it's wrong, and it's a terrible mistake for the country. I mean, I'm really astounded by the lack of consistency. And when people say, oh, well, that was then and this is now, well, OK, it is now and things are worse. You know, wages growth is lower. Multi-factor productivity, you know, stagnant or going backwards. Business investment at historic lows. So, you know, these things...
Would your argument be then, Jennifer Westacott, that if anything, we are more requiring as a nation and as a business community of a company tax cut now than we were 5 years ago?
Absolutely. I mean, the things have got more urgent. We're trying to diversify the economy. You know, we've got to kind of tackle this non-mining investment problem. Well, you talk to business, the rate matters. The rate really matters. This is what is kind of, you know, I think bewildering that people don't understand. We live in a global economy. Capital is mobile. Labour is mobile. What are we talking about? We're talking about, you know, putting our company taxes in stasis. Our competitors must be rubbing their hands together about that. We're talking about putting a new top marginal tax rate on top income earners, you know, an absolute incentive killer. And people say to me, does anyone know what is actually happening in the world?
What is happening in the world?
Well, let's take the UK. You know, they have lowered their tax rate from 28 to 20. Last year, record inbound investment, 85,000 new jobs. So if this is such a terrible idea, why are other people doing it? Why are European countries doing it? Why have Asian countries kept their rates low? They know that it is absolutely essential to attract investment.
Is the BCA comfortable with the time lag, even on the government's side of things? So even if the company tax cuts get through the parliament, I wouldn't mind your view on that as well, because I suspect that they probably won't, even if Malcolm Turnbull wins the election, it's still a 10-year time horizon before they get rolled right out across the business community. Is that acceptable, or is that even realistic?
7 years for everyone to go to the 27% rate, 27.5 rate. So, look, I think, you know, you've got to look at this in stages. The first stage, the small business, that's about cash flow. That's about freeing up cash flow. Small business will use that to invest in equipment, to put more people on. Bigger companies, which have longer lead times for investment, they start to look at the net present value of investments over a 5, 10, 15-year time frame. They'll be looking at that and saying, well, that's starting to make an investment a bit more attractive than it was before.
So you'd need it enshrined then, because otherwise that investment won't happen.
Exactly. This is the crucial thing. And this is what the British did. And their legislation says that the Parliament can ramp it up or slow it down. Now, you'd want to have a piece of legislation that gave a Parliament the capacity to ramp it up or slow it down. And, you know, the things that would need to ramp it up if our competitiveness continues to falter, if economic circumstances keep just chugging along at sort of less than optimal levels, you'd want the Parliament to be responsible and say, well, OK, now we need to bring those tax cuts forward. And also, of course, all of these things depend on the fiscal circumstances at the time.
But we've got a situation where a lot of people who may have the balance of power in the Senate crossbenches are indicating there's no way they're going to give full passage to this tax package overall.
Yeah, and I think that's a very irresponsible decision. And I think that the problem that, and you're having a very important conversation with the Minister, you know, Australia really, I think, will be far worse off if we've got another hung parliament or another obstructive Senate. I mean, when I talk to people, we do these town halls and 20,000 people ring in. We've talked to about 40,000 people recently. You know what they say? They say we have just got to get on with stuff. We have just got to get on with things. And they know that business makes jobs. They know that business underpins the wealth of the nation. They may not agree with everything they do. They get it.
But based on the polls, Jennifer Westacott, and based on the fact that it is a full Senate election halving the quota, it's almost inevitable that we're going to have, at least in the Senate, another scenario where there is a large crossbench that would probably be more inclined to block company tax cuts than pass them.
Well, I mean, we won't know until we see the kind of, you know, the end of the election and what happens in the Senate. But you know, I would just appeal to people to think about, obviously, how they vote. I mean, people will vote however they want. That's why we live in a democracy. But we will be arguing very hard to the Senate that it has stifled public policy in this country for too long. And you made this point, you know, in your column this week. You know, we have had suboptimal, compromised public policy as people try and push it through a hostile Senate. How long, as a country, can we go on making bad decisions or half-right decisions and then watch our competitors just sweep over us?
Now, the BCA is planning a campaign What's the campaign about? How much does it cost? When does it start?
Well, we have stepped up in this election, and normally we would play a kind of lower key role in the election. We'll be much more active than we normally are. This will be a sort of targeted campaign. It will have some advertising. We are mobilising our CEOs to get out and talk about...
What's the theme?
Well, the theme is actually the role of business in growing the economy and creating jobs, because this is what people are forgetting. I mean, business underpins the wealth of this country. It underpins our capacity to pay for health and education. And so to denigrate business is to actually start to challenge whether or not we can create jobs. It's to denigrate the hard-working people who are working in business. It's to deny the role that business plays in the fabric of our society. That's what our campaign is focused on, the role that business plays in the wealth of the country.
Labor has said that it supports company tax cuts for what it regards as small businesses with a turnover of $2 million or less. The government is almost saying that you're talking micro small business if you don't extend that out to 10 million or thereabouts. What's the BCA's view?
We think you've got to deal with the whole business community. I mean, the whole business community it interacts with one another. It's the collective of the business community. I mean, there's $440 billion a year of interactions between small and big business. So if you just stifle kind of, the business kind of working with one another, or you create bad incentives across the business community, you will actually cause a great deal of harm. Can I read you something that Bill Shorten said at this ACOS speech that you quoted yesterday in your column? Meanwhile, lowering the corporate rate for small businesses only creates an artificial incentive for Australian businesses to downside. In worst-case scenarios, some businesses might actually lay people off to get smaller. That was then, this is now, go figure. I mean, this would be a very bad policy, and it denies the fact that the business community is one community, a highly integrated community, and the economy benefits from that whole business community working well together.
You mentioned just before, though, that you believe that Labor's taken the approach they have because of politics, for public opinion reasons. What does that say about the national dialogue, though? Because if Labor is going in that direction because it believes that it's popular, it says that, at least in Labor's view, a large swathe of the community just doesn't buy the very argument that we've been talking about here, which is the role of business and how it underpins wealth in this country.
Yeah, look, I think when you talk to people, they understand this. They absolutely get it. I think if you kind of try and run this kind of anti-business agenda, I mean, it's easy in elections to sort of say what you're not going to do. It's easy to say we stand up for these people and we don't stand up for these people. It's easy to characterise business as the big end of town. It's easy to dismiss the role of business, and it's easy to create that wedge. Now, my concern is that, this is short-term politics against the long-term interests of the country. And there will be consequences, in terms of the community attitude, and we'll obviously have to kind of really step up and try and turn that attitude around.
And that's part of the campaign that the BCA is planning, to try to appeal to people in terms of something that has currently been a failing, I would argue, by all sides that have tried to spruik company tax cuts, including the Labor Party when it tried to sell them a few years ago in government, including the now coalition government as it's tried to sell them.
Yeah, we've got to make the point, and people, when I talk to them, they get it. They know that businesses create jobs. They know that it's business that employs the bulk of the people they know of themselves. But as a country, we have to ask ourselves this question. Do we want a future that is a future about enterprise, about hope, about aspirations for Australians, where people get ahead? Or do we want a future where somehow government is meant to fix everything? More and more people work for government or are paid for by government. I tell you something, that is the European model, and it's a disaster.
Do you think there's a danger we're heading towards the European model?
Well, I think the idea that an alternative government would actually say business is bad says that to me, Paul. It says to me we don't regard the business community as vital to the Australian economy. So somehow everyone who's working in a supermarket or a shop has led some kind of futile existence, and really the only meaningful existence is to work for government or be paid for by government. Well, I think that's a very, very, very bad choice to put to the Australian people.
It seems to me you're really making an argument here that this is a pretty significant election, that this might be a turning point election for the country. Is that how you see it?
Absolutely. I think I've not seen a more kind of divisive anti-business agenda put. I think it's a turning point for the country, and I think there are very, very severe consequences if we head down the path of an anti-business, anti-economic growth agenda in favour for more spending, a spending plan without a growth plan, will just lead to crippling rates of taxation and more deficits and a very, very fragile and non-resilient economy.
Just finally, before we run out of time, how comfortable are all your members with just how, I guess, politicised this message has become? You know, the business community probably has always lent towards the coalition over the Labor Party, but is also very aware that it has to work with both sides. It strikes me that the way that this debate has polarised in this campaign, more so than usual, has made it quite a political position that the BCA has to take with your positioning. How comfortable are the CEOs with that?
Well, I think that this is not about vote for this party or vote for that party. This is sort of what kind of a country do we want to live in, and what kind of future do we want to have for our country, and trying to make it really excruciatingly clear to the Australian community that a weakened business community is a weak Australia. A weakened business community is less jobs for people. A weakened business community impacts on those 10 million people who work in businesses and will impact terribly on the wealth of the nation and the capacity to pay for the services that people need. That's the job we've got to do. That's the choice that I think it's now before the Australian people.
Well, there's just under 4 weeks to go in the election campaign. We'll be able to continue talking about this for some time to come, but we're out of time today. Thanks very much, Jennifer Westacott, for joining us on Australian Agenda.